We often look at constitutions, these founding documents, with a kind of reverence, like they're sacred texts.
Absolutely. Especially things like the U.S. Bill of Rights. We assume those words alone are the guarantee of freedom.
But history, well, it tells a bit of a darker story, doesn't it?
It really does. The 20th century especially is full of examples. Regimes with these beautifully written progressive constitutions.
On paper, they look amazing.
Exactly. Yet they presided over horrific tyranny. The words themselves, they mean nothing if there's no mechanism, no will to enforce them.
And that's the paradox, right? That's what we're really digging into today.
Yeah.
This deep dive is about comparative constitutional law. We're looking at three really different systems from our source material.
You've got the U.S. Constitution, with its Bill of Rights, obviously.
Then the 1936 Soviet Constitution, the Stalin Constitution.
And finally, Israel's unique system. No single written constitution, but basic laws.
So our mission here is to try and figure out what actually matters more for protecting citizens. Is it having a long list of rights written down?
Or is it about the institutions? The courts, the legislature, maybe even civil society. The things that actually bring those rights to life, or are supposed to.
And here's a real surprise, something that jumps out from the sources right away. If you just read the text, forget the history for a second. Forget Stalin, the gulags.
Okay.
The 1936 Soviet Constitution. In many ways, it looked better on paper, more comprehensive in its promises than the U.S. Constitution.
That's a provocative point, but yeah, textually there's a case to be made. Let's unpack that.
Where do we start?
I think the biggest, most striking difference is social and economic rights. The U.S. Constitution mostly deals in what lawyers call negative rights.
Meaning what the government can't do to you.
Exactly. It can't stop your speech, can't take your property without due process, things like that. Limits on government power.
Okay. But the Soviet Constitution promised positive rights.
Right. What the state must actively provide for you. And this is where the Soviet text, on paper, just went miles beyond the American one.
How so? Give us some examples.
Well, the Stalin Constitution explicitly guaranteed huge social and economic benefits. The right to work, for instance, guaranteed employment.
The state guarantees you a job.
Yes. And the right to rest. Paid vacations, state-run sanatoriums for holidays, and Social Security. Insurance for sickness, old age, it's all laid out there.
It wasn't just about material security either, was it? Education.
That too. Guaranteed free universal education. And higher education for those who qualified.
So the text really paints this picture of a state that takes care of you from cradle to grave, almost. Job, holiday, healthcare, education.
And crucially, these weren't just policy goals. They were written into the Constitution, the highest law of the land.
Okay, now let's contrast that with the U.S. Constitution.
It's almost the polar opposite in this area. The U.S. Constitution is basically silent on most of these things.
No mention of a right to work, guaranteed welfare, universal health care.
Nope. Those things exist in the U.S. system now, like Social Security, unemployment benefits.
Yeah.
But they come from ordinary laws passed by Congress. Right.
Yeah.
Statutes. Congress can change them, amend them, even repeal them with a simple majority vote. They're not fundamental constitutionally protected rights. They're legal entitlements, but not constitutional ones.
That does raise a pretty critical question, though, and the sources touch on this. If the U.S. Constitution doesn't guarantee these basic material needs, isn't it sort of incomplete, maybe even harsh for the average person?
It's a fair point, and it reflects a fundamentally different philosophy. The U.S. approach, historically, was about limiting federal power.
Keep the government small.
Yeah, focus on ensuring individual liberty, and then individuals and states could figure out the material needs themselves. It prioritized, let's say, freedom from government intervention over guaranteed material comfort by the government. Different priorities.
Okay. And then we have Israel, which is different again.
Right. Israel is fascinating. It's a developed democracy, but it doesn't even have a single unified constitution.
How does it handle things like welfare and health then?
Entirely by statute, just like the U.S. does with Social Security. Israel has its basic laws, which function a bit like constitutional chapters adopted over time.
Piece by piece.
Exactly. But things like the compulsory education law from 1949, that's just a regular law, not a constitutional guarantee.
So purely looking at the text on material guarantees.
The Soviet Constitution looked like a worker's paradise compared to the much more bare-bones U.S. text or the statutory approach in Israel.
But like you said at the start, a guarantee is only as good as the system that actually enforces it.
Precisely.
So let's shift to those classic civil liberties. Freedom of speech, equality. This is where things get really interesting, isn't it? Where the Soviet paper promises started to crumble.
Absolutely. Let's start with equality. Again, the Soviet text sounds great. Explicit guarantees, equal rights for women.
Which was quite progressive for 1936.
Very. And an explicit ban on racial and national discrimination, all spelled out.
Whereas the U.S. system, it relies more on the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause.
And the general idea that the Bill of Rights applies to everyone. It took court cases and later legislation to really flesh that out.
And Israel.
Israel uses its basic law on human dignity and liberty from 1992. The courts interpret that law to include equality. It's judicial interpretation, not an explicit clause like the Soviets had.
Okay, but equality is one thing. What about the really core freedoms? Speech, press, assembly.
Now we get to the heart of the matter. This really raises the question, when is a constitutional guarantee not actually a guarantee?
Because the Soviet text did guarantee these things, right? Article 125.
It did. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, but, and this is the crucial part.
There's always a but.
Always. These rights were guaranteed only in conformity with the interests of working people and, quote, in order to strengthen the socialist system.
Ah, there's the catch.
That's the fatal flaw. That asterisk, as you called it earlier, it completely negates the guarantee.
Because who decides what's in the interests of working people?
In a one-party state. The Communist Party, of course. And only the party.
So if you criticize Stalin or the economic plan or anything the party did,
you were, by definition, acting against the interests of the working people and weakening the socialist system. Your constitutional right just vanished.
The right disappears the moment you try to use it in any meaningful way, especially for dissent. That's chilling.
It's Orwellian. The Constitution itself becomes the tool of control, not protection. Now compare that to the U.S. First Amendment.
No ifs, ands, or buts there.
Right. It's an absolute prohibition. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. It protects speech even when it's unpopular, offensive, or critical of the government. That's the whole point.
And Israel, again, the third way. No explicit First Amendment equivalent in the basic laws.
Correct. But those freedoms are robustly protected. How? Through deep-rooted democratic traditions, common law principles inherited from the British Mandate period, and critically, an incredibly active and independent Supreme Court.
So institutions again.
Institutions and legal culture, yes, not just the text.
What about religion? That's another classic area of constitutional concern.
Also very telling. The U.S. First Amendment has the two famous clauses. No establishment of religion.
Separation of church and state, basically.
And free exercise of religion, protecting religious practice from government interference.
The Soviet approach, Article 124.
It guaranteed freedom of religious worship, which sounds okay on the surface, but
Another bullet.
it also explicitly guaranteed freedom of anti-religious propaganda.
Ah. So the state actively promotes atheism.
Exactly. It was constitutional permission for the state to undermine religion, while technically allowing people to worship, under strict control, of course.
And Israel.
Different model again. Freedom of worship is generally respected for all faiths, but there's no formal separation of religion and state like in the U.S. Certain areas, like marriage and divorce for Jewish citizens, are handled by religious courts. It's a complex, often debated balance managed through laws and court rulings.
Even when you look at things like justice and due process, the Soviet Constitution had words that sounded, well, pretty modern.
It did. Things like presumption of innocence, right to a defense, public court trials. Article 127 even said arrest was only lawful with a court order or a prosecutor's sanction.
Sounds reasonable.
On paper. But again, enforcement, reality. When the party, or more accurately, the secret police, like the NKVD, decided you were an enemy.
Those paper rights meant absolutely nothing.
Nothing. Compare that to the protections in the U.S. Fifth through Eighth Amendments, due process, jury trial, right to counsel. Those rights mean something because you have an independent judiciary, at least in theory, where you can assert them against the government.
Okay, so we've done the textual comparison. Soviet text often promised more material comfort, and its civil liberties looked detailed, sometimes even more explicit than the U.S. text.
Well, on the surface, yeah.
But we all know the reality. The lived experience was vastly different. Which brings us to the core issue, doesn't it? The reality gap. It's all about the institutions.
That's the crux of it. Why did the Soviet citizen, with all those wonderful paper rights, live in fear under a totalitarian regime?
Why?
Because the Soviet Constitution wasn't really a blueprint for governance. It was essentially a mask. propaganda,
Yeah.
designed to look good to the outside world and give a veneer of legitimacy to absolute power.
So how did the system ensure those rights were worthless in practice?
Our sources point to sort of three key mechanisms, three failures of implementation. First, every single right was conditional on ideology.
You had to toe the party line.
Exactly. If exercising your right didn't strengthen socialism, as defined by the party, then you had no right. Second, the entire system, courts included, was controlled by the Communist Party. Judges were party members. Their loyalty was to the party, not the law or the Constitution.
No independence.
None whatsoever. And third, maybe most important, no independent enforcement. You couldn't effectively sue the government if it violated your constitutional rights. If there's no remedy, there's no right.
The institutions designed to protect you were the very state you needed protection from.
Precisely. Now contrast that with the U.S. Fewer grand promises on the economic side? Definitely.
No guaranteed job or vacation in the Constitution.
Right. But the promises it did make free speech, due process, were potentially enforceable because of independent institutions, the separation of powers, and especially an independent judiciary.
Judges who couldn't easily be fired by the president or Congress for making unpopular decisions.
That independence, imperfect as it might be sometimes, allows the text to become a shield you can actually use. It allows rights to be defended and even expanded over time through interpretation.
And this makes the Israeli case so important, doesn't it? It shows you don't strictly need that single perfect document.
Exactly. Israel is a living example of a democracy that functions and protects liberties pretty well overall without one codified constitution.
How do the sources describe its success then?
They talk about its living institutions. Liberty isn't secured just by the basic laws, but by a strong legal tradition, the power of precedent, stare decisis, and crucially, a very assertive Supreme Court engaged in robust judicial review.
So the courts are key there too. Even though the Knesset, the parliament, can technically change the basic laws with a simple majority.
The Supreme Court has shown it's willing to step in and review, sometimes even strike down, legislation that conflicts with the basic laws, particularly human dignity and liberty. They act as a check, even without a rigid, hard-to-amend constitution like the U.S. has.
It really hammers home the lesson, doesn't it? The words are secondary.
They matter, they set a standard, but they're not enough. It's the people, the culture, and especially the independent institutions that interpret, enforce, and ultimately live by those words.
A constitution can be a blueprint, but if the builders are corrupt or the foundations are weak,
The whole structure becomes either a facade, a mask for tyranny like the Soviet one, or hopefully a genuine shield for freedom.
So let's bring this back to you, the listener. What's the takeaway here? The sources pose a pretty stark challenge, really. Knowing what we know about the texts and the institutions, would you rather live in Israel, which deliberately lacks a single constitution, or under the USSR's 1936 Stalin Constitution, which, on paper, looked so progressive?
The choice seems obvious in hindsight, but thinking about it forces you to weigh text versus institutional integrity.
Absolutely. It shows that flowery words mean nothing without trustworthy institutions.
And that leads us to a final thought, something for you to chew on. The sources highlight how the process for changing a constitution or the fundamental laws is incredibly revealing.
A key indicator of institutional health.
You could say that. Look at the U.S. The amendment process is famously deliberately difficult.
2/3 of Congress, 3/4 of the states, it takes a massive consensus.
Right. It prioritizes stability, maybe even rigidity. Makes the fundamental law hard to change.
The Soviet process, completely centralized, controlled by the party, adaptable only to the leadership's whims.
Total control, zero stability from the perspective of rights. And Israel. The basic laws are technically flexible. Knesset majority can change them.
But constrained in practice by the courts.
Exactly. A dynamic balance. So the final question for you is this. If you were designing a state, what's the better approach?
Do you prioritize stability, making the Constitution really hard to amend, potentially leading to outdated rules?
Or do you prioritize adaptability, making it easier to change the law to meet new challenges, but maybe opening the door for hasty or oppressive changes?
And the tough part is, either choice stability or adaptability can be exploited if you don't have strong, independent institutions you can trust.
That's the ultimate dilemma, isn't it? Where do you place your faith? In the permanence of the words or the integrity of the people and systems meant to uphold them? Something to think about.